Jutting into the Persian Gulf is Qatar, a tiny state with big ambitions and one that consistently punches above its weight. With a population of 3 million, of which only 10% are citizens, Qatar is one of the richest countries on the planet. Its citizens enjoy a tax-free income, free education, free healthcare, and a guaranteed minimum pension of $4,000 per month upon retirement. But Qatar showed its financial might after investing more than $200 billion to host the 2022 World Cup. This was the most expensive World Cup ever, 3 times the cost of the last 8 World Cups combined. Whether spending this much makes financial sense is beside the point. Qatar is rich and believes it has a master plan to stay wealthy. Qatar was not always a wealthy nation. Since the mid-18th century, the country has been ruled by the Al Thani family. At the time, it was a barren and impoverished backwater. Its people depended on pearl diving, fishing, and trade. However, the collapse of the pearl market in the 1920s would mark the beginning of years of poverty, malnutrition, and disease. But this was about to change. Qatar made its first oil discovery in the Dukhan field. That marked a turning point and the first step of an economic transformation. Qatar's oil reserves were modest in comparison to its neighbors, so it always lagged behind them economically. But in 1971, the country struck gas in the North Field, the largest single gas field in the world. But contrary to expectations, this was a source of bitter disappointment as the country had hoped for more oil. At the time, gas did not generate the same big revenues oil did, and the country did not have the infrastructure needed to exploit it. So for the time being, the gas was left untouched. In 1972, the emir was deposed by his cousin Khalifa bin Hamad while on a hunting trip in Iran. The new emir committed more funds in social programs, housing, health, education, and pensions. However, in the 1980s, global oil prices fell, slowing down Qatar's economy, which was highly dependent on oil revenues. The emir started to lose support from the rest of the ruling family and other powerful personalities. So, in 1995, Crown Prince Hamad bin Khalifa assumed leadership while his father was away on a trip to Switzerland. He left him a message simply saying, "Don't come back." As emir, Sheikh Hamad was wise and farsighted. You see, he understood the country's natural resources were finite. Oil was its strength, but also its biggest weakness. The country was always vulnerable to oil price fluctuations. In his mind, there had to be change that would reduce its dependency on oil. So, he pumped $20 billion to complete developing the North Gas Field, and this enabled the country to start exporting liquefied natural gas in 1996. 10 years later, Qatar would become the largest exporter of LNG. Its GDP had grown from just $8 billion in 1995 to $115 billion in 2008. The country would then launch the Qatar Vision 2030.
قطر قصة نهضة. حرصت دولة قطر على أن تكون عضواً فاعلاً في المجتمع الدولي.
A master plan and a clear roadmap for its future. A future of sustainable development that would secure a high standard of living for all citizens now and the generations to come. And this brings us back to the World Cup. More than $200 billion was invested in its build-up period, and it completely transformed the country. Most of it was invested in infrastructure projects that included a new airport, metro system, 9 new stadiums, a new hotel, a new city, and a new port project. But Qatar's transformation is not just about football. It is part and parcel of its grand vision. The infrastructure and transport developments are just a foundation for the country's future goals. You see, Qatar aspires to become a cultural hub and a tourist destination. Before the World Cup, Qatar was averaging 2 million tourists per year. The country received over 765,000 visitors in the first 2 weeks of the World Cup, which is expected to attract 1.2 million people by the end of the tournament. The country hopes the global attention will translate to more tourists who will in turn utilize the new infrastructure. One way Qatar is beefing up its list of attractions is through its fast-expanding museum sector. Qatar museums spend $1 billion annually on art from top artists around the world. Currently, it has 3 museums, which include its jewel, the Museum of Islamic Art. 3 more are planned to open by 2030, staying in line with its national vision. As Qatar exported more oil and natural gas, the country found itself with a budget surplus, even after funding its citizens' social programs. But its economy was heavily reliant on oil and gas. So the country launched the Qatar Investment Authority in 2008. The Sovereign Wealth Fund would diversify its economy through investments in different sectors around the world while saving for Qatar's future generations. The fund has grown into one of the top 10 in the world with a valuation of $450 billion. Another of Qatar's major weaknesses is the excessive reliance on a foreign workforce. The low rate of the Qatari workforce in the non-governmental sectors is a challenge. The country believes its future economic success will increasingly depend on the ability of the Qatari people to deal with a knowledgeable and extremely competitive world. Through its Qatarization policy, it aims to replace expatriates in critical positions and ensure that 50% of the workforce is made up of Qatari nationals by 2030. Therefore, it invested in the education of its citizens by creating a modern and world-class educational system that would transfer the necessary skills. At the moment, only 23% of the workforce is Qatari. So, for the foreseeable future, Qatar will have to continue to make up for the shortages of local labor with qualified expatriate workers. But here's the problem. The World Cup brought attention to the country's poor treatment of its foreign workers. Its Kafala system of sponsorship meant migrant workers were overly dependent on their employers. This made them vulnerable to exploitation and sometimes forced labor. Workers were not allowed to change jobs or exit the country without their employer's permission. But changes were made to the system in 2020 that gave workers the freedom to change jobs with notice and also to leave the country at their own will. In March 2021, Qatar became the first country in the Gulf region to adopt a non-discriminatory minimum wage that applies to all workers of all nationalities in all sectors, including domestic work. This resulted in 13% of the workforce, about 280,000 people, seeing their wages rise to the new minimum threshold. That's a good start. And according to the International Labor Organization, there's still more to be done. For every great plan, obstacles are expected. The neighboring Gulf nations severed diplomatic ties with Qatar in 2017, putting a strain on the country's economy. But Qatar was resilient and only came out much stronger in the end, as it learned to become more independent. Qatar believes it has a solid plan for its future. But will it bear fruits? The first test will be on the legacy of the World Cup infrastructure, and thereafter, only time will tell. In 2019, the IMF published a report that projected that most Gulf countries could exhaust their financial wealth within 25 years. Qatar itself does not plan to be part of this statistic.